Well, good. It's so nice to see you again on this gorgeous autumn day. And we had a wonderful weekend, didn't we? Yes, we did. Okay, today I want us to begin. We move ahead. We're moving ahead. Today we begin with Mr. John Locke. For the next 3 classes, Mr. Locke. It is hard to believe that a little book like this, in this not terribly distinguished edition, mind you, but nevertheless in this edition of just over 100 pages, that a book of this length could have such world-shaping effects. If anyone were to ever doubt the importance of ideas, political ideas in history, I would only say to you to consult the history and the influence of John Locke. Remarkable. I want to talk today a little bit about Mr. Locke. John Locke is, for our purposes today, I mean, there are many reasons why one would read him in different kinds of classes, but for our purposes, John Locke gives the modern state the expression that is most familiar to us. His writings seem to have been so completely absorbed and adopted by Thomas Jefferson when he wrote the Declaration of Independence that Locke seems to have become virtually a kind of honorary founding father, as it were, of America. Among other things, John Locke advocates the natural liberty and equality of human beings, our natural rights to such things as life, liberty, and what he calls estate or property. The idea that government, at least legitimate government, is government by consent. That legitimate government is necessarily limited, and limited government constituted by a separation of powers. And that when governments become repressive, or that when governments become abusive of natural rights, that the people have a right to revolution. In addition to this, John Locke was a famous advocate of religious toleration. His name is forever linked with our ideas today of what we might call liberal or constitutional democracy. He gives the modern constitutional state its definitive and in many ways most familiar expression. Yet Locke did not arise ex nihilo, nor did anyone. Locke's writings come from somewhere and from some source. They were prepared in many ways, in part by Machiavelli, who had died approximately a century before Locke's birth, but more importantly by another English writer, or by an English writer with whom we have spent some time, namely Mr. Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes took Machiavelli's idea of the prince and in effect turned it into a theory or doctrine of sovereignty. The Hobbesian sovereign is at the basis of our ideas of impersonal, or what we might call representative government. He transforms princely rule, Hobbes does, into an office, into an office called the sovereign. And this office is, for Hobbes, the creation of a social contract, or covenant, as he calls it, responsible to the agents or persons who have created the contract. Hobbes had taught that the sovereign is representative of the people who create his office in order to ensure peace, justice, and order. Without the power of the sovereign, we would find ourselves in a condition of nature, a state of nature, a term coined by Hobbes to indicate a world without civil authority, or at least with only weak civil authority unable to enforce common rules and laws. Hobbes gave voice to the doctrine of secular absolutism, one that invests the sovereign with absolute power to do whatever is necessary to ensure, again, the rule of law, justice, and political stability. And out of these rather harsh and formidable premises, Locke created a different, what we would think of as a more liberal constitutional theory of the state, while being still in many ways very dependent on the premises that Hobbes, again modifying Machiavelli, had undertaken. Locke set out a process of domestication. He set out to tame or to domesticate Hobbes's fierce or harsh theory of absolute government, which had found few defenders in his own day. Locke's most important book, political, at least his most important work of political theory, of political philosophy, is his two treatises of civil government, of which we are only reading the second. The book we have before us is called, this often simply referred to as the second treatise. But you will probably have suspected, I think, that the second treatise was preceded by a first treatise. The first treatise is much longer than the second treatise, and it was an elaborate and painstaking, one could almost say, deconstruction of the theory of the divine right of kings, which in his era had received expression by a man named Robert Filmer, whose name appears, I think, occasionally in the second treatise. Filmer had written a book called Patriarcha, and the Patriarcha had argued that all political authority derives from the grant of authority that God had given to Adam, and therefore that all legitimate authority has divine right behind it. Locke's first treatise is a very important, but also, I have to say, extremely tedious work. And you should be grateful that I am not assigning it to you. But it's a very interesting book in its own right of in many ways, biblical criticism and exposition. But it's only in the second treatise that Locke set out to set out his own positive theory of government, as it were. This book was written, we now believe, shortly before the famous Whig Revolution of 1688. And in it, Locke sets out his theory of parliamentary supremacy, rule of law, and constitutional government. Locke was, I mean, to put it maybe slightly oddly, Locke was, in his day, to some degree, what Aristotle was to his. The second treatise is intended as a practical book. It was a book addressed not so much to the philosophers of his age, but to Englishmen, written to them in the everyday language of their time. He wrote to capture, in a way, the common sense of his time. Although this is not to say Locke was not, at the same time, a deeply controversial figure. Locke had the ability, and it's a very desirable ability, to take, in many ways, radical or even revolutionary ideas and express them in a kind of language that makes people believe that this is what they had thought all along. And that is, to some degree, the genius of the second treatise. In many ways, that is easier for us because Locke's language has become, for us, the kind of, I would almost say, common sense or shorthand language for the way we think about politics. And it was, again, a mark of his genius to be able to create that language and give it a stamp that seemed to make people believe that this is what they had simply been thinking all along. Locke was himself a deeply political man. But he was also, at the same time, as I've just been hinting perhaps, a very reticent one. He lived in a period of intense religious and political conflict. He was just a boy in school when a king, Charles I, was executed. And he was an adult when another king, James II, was overthrown and forced into exile. Locke lived, I mean, he was a younger contemporary of Hobbes, but he lived in a period of immense civil conflict and war. Locke spent many years at Oxford, where he was both a student and a fellow, and he was suspected throughout much of his time there of harboring radical political sympathies. But he was so cautious and careful in expressing them that after many years, even those closest to him were unclear as to what his opinions were. The master of Locke's own residential college at Oxford, Balliol College, described Mr. Locke as the master of taciturnity. A master of taciturnity, because he could not discover through questioning and so on Locke's opinions on religious and political matters. Just think of that. There used to be a very wonderful bust of Locke in the lobby of the British Art Center. And I used to recommend to students when they were down in that part of campus to stop in and look at his face, because as with Machiavelli and others, the face is very revealing. And I used to ask people to see, do you detect in here the sense of